Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, and regulatory landscape and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me this afternoon, we have Alex Gunz, fund manager at Heptagon Capital, Alastair Paterson, co-founder and CEO of Harmonic Security, and Dave Harrison-Smith, head of technology investing at Bailard. We're here to discuss why the potential in cybersecurity lies in AI's ability to recognize patterns and optimize threat detection. It is great to have all of you with us, gentlemen. Welcome to Trade Talks. And Alex, that's really what the challenge is when we think about cyber is good actors, bad actors are both leveraging the same type of emerging technology, such as artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, AI, Jill, is an absolute game changer. I think we've seen that play out across every single industry. And effectively, what it's doing within the world of cyber is it's creating a whole new set of tools, both for attackers and for defenders. And I think really the starting point in terms of how we look at it is, look, data will have zero value unless you secure it, you store it, and you analyze it. And as simply as the amount of data grows, the cyber opportunity grows.
Yeah, and Alastair, let's talk about it from the enterprise perspective, because there's been this rush to get some sort of generative AI product out, whether to internal within the enterprise or to go to market. Do you think there's almost too much of a risk there with assessing the ROI relative to cyber risk? And then how do you think employees are perceiving this shift?
Yeah, I think a lot of enterprises are keen to jump in the AI bandwagon, of course. But I think the challenge really comes down to data privacy concerns because, as it's always been in security, where does your data go? How is it being secured? Who has access to it? What is it being used for? It is all critical. And in this era, there's a lot of companies that are taking in this data from companies and then training their models on top of it or not holding it in a way that company would like. So there's one thing that's, the corporates themselves trying to put controls around this. The second piece is what the employees are doing, as you're saying. And, at Harmonic, we've seen around 5,000 different AI applications in use across the enterprises we protect. So it goes way beyond the ChatGPTs and Copilots of this world. There's a lot of other apps out there to worry about.
Yeah. And Dave, you make a great point that as excited as the enterprise is about AI technology, the bad actors are just equally as excited. What are the three areas that you see impacting cyber?
Yeah, so it's definitely the cybersecurity threat landscape is just getting worse and worse. I mean, ransomware attacks were up 88% last year. They're up again significantly this year. And I think both Alex and Alastair make a great point. That the AI tools that are out there are being used by the bad actors as well. So you're not seeing the phishing attempts come from the Nigerian prince anymore asking for $100. It's from close personal contacts or people that look like close personal contacts or people within your company. So we see that as a significant area of increased threats. Alastair brought up data leakage as well. So, employees, there was a famous use case a while back where an employee uploaded proprietary data about a semiconductor design to a large language model that then was used to train and showed up at another company. So data leakage is obviously another area where companies are very concerned. And then lastly, I'll bring up that the use of agents, of autonomous bots that are being used by companies is a huge area of opportunity, but it's an additional attack vector that can potentially be exploited. Anytime you have a new script or workload that is accessing or accessible to or by the internet, that's an additional attack vector that attackers can target.
Yeah. And Alex, you bring up a great point in your notes that cyber risk is basically asymmetric, right? You can mitigate, let's call them 99% of the time, right? That 1% or if an incident becomes a breach, that has a bigger impact than the 99% that potentially have been mitigated.
You're absolutely right, Jill. I mean, it's funny whenever we talk about cyber with our investors at Heptagon, I often bring up Mike Tyson, which is not an obvious name you'd expect, but he famously talks about how everyone has a strategy until they get punched in the face. And I think this speaks precisely to the asymmetry that you highlighted. And I guess the way to frame it financially is as follows, that, typically you'll see about $200-300 billion spent on cyber every year, but actually the cost of cybercrime is hugely more than that. We're talking about $9 trillion this year. That's a third of US GDP. It's 25 times Apple's last reported revenues. That's the asymmetry.
Yeah. And Alastair, this might sound more of a rudimentary question here, but with all these generative AI applications, not necessarily just the in-house ones that are being built, but some of the others that are broadly available to everyone, how do you ensure that employees aren't including language in there, or maybe perhaps not even realizing that they are putting sensitive data in there? Let's say, and perhaps, I have a question around, my client needs an answer to XYZ. I don't know that. Let me throw that through one of the Gen AI platforms. Perhaps I'm completely unaware that I am including proprietary data in there as I'm trying to think about a strategy for my client.
Yeah, this is a huge issue because you also don't want to try to block the end users from adopting these applications, or you're going to miss out on all the benefits of this wave. And so, or they find ways around those controls. So I think it starts with visibility and getting close to the business to understand the use cases. So you want to know, what are the applications that the business needs? What are the use cases that we're trying to put in place here? Having got the visibility into that, then it's having appropriate controls that don't inhibit the employees too much. So certainly from a data protection perspective, you want to start looking at what sensitive data is leaving the business and where is it going. I think the AI era gives us opportunities to take new approaches to doing that. The classic methods of just blocking end users or trying to match on social security numbers and credit cards, we know that doesn't work. But with all the challenges of generative AI, the benefits are that we can start to use these models intelligently to understand our data better, understand what data is going where more effectively, and prevent data leakage like we couldn't last time around.
Yeah, well, of course, you also want to make sure that there is, senior leadership is promoting this trust culture throughout the company as well, and that there's appropriate training in place. And so, Dave, do you think perhaps there's too much focus on mitigating attacks because of Gen AI? Are we still focusing cyber strategies on basic, authentication and making sure that you're not clicking on the wrong things? Because the basics you don't want to forget about also, because then that opens up a whole other set of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Jill. And, I think Alastair makes a good point at the same time that, we believe that if you're not pressing forward on AI, that you are being left behind competitively. But at the same time, I think no companies are going to say, I want to adopt AI and I don't care about the risks. Right. So you bring up a good point that you need to have a foundation there, and the training is incredibly important. But there's a clear gap as well in terms of companies that are adopting modern data practices and data architectures that we believe are really foundational to adopting AI. And we think that's going to be really important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Dave, when you think about it, technology begets more technology, data begets more data. I mean, that's the whole point of this exercise, right? Leveraging these emerging technologies so that we can develop new processes and new products and so forth. So it's only going to exponentially get bigger. So let's think about this through the investment lens. Where do those opportunities lie within the landscape?
Yeah, great question. And we talked a little bit about data governance earlier, and it's to your point. It's data governance is not something that's new, right? But it's just getting an increased focus because of the ability of AI to basically vacuum up all of the available data. So a lot of companies are realizing that their data practices that they've lived with for years and years are kind of a mess. And with AI, all available internal data can be more easily accessible for better or for worse. So there's this immediate need, this foundational work that needs to be done in order to implement AI and copilots and capture the benefits of artificial intelligence that we're all seeing in our personal lives. The other benefit that we see from data governance is it reduces the blast radius of a potential breach as well. So that's another immediate focus that we're hearing from end customers. It reduces the ability for any potential penetrator to move laterally within a network. So we're focused on data governance first. The second area that we're seeing increased focus on would be zero trust and modern zero trust platforms. So it gets back to that modernization requirement that AI is really putting pressure on in enterprises. So data surveys have shown that about 40% of enterprises have not yet embarked on zero trust architecture journey. It's currently seen as best practices, and we feel that it's a necessary step in order to capture the upside of artificial intelligence.
Yeah. And Alastair, when you think about this, are there almost too many vendors? Is it hard to discern what areas of the tech stack require capital allocation towards it? In other words, who owns Gen AI in the enterprise, right? What vendors should you be working with? How do you make those decisions in terms of where you're going to allocate those resources?
Yeah, huge challenge in enterprise, I think, is dealing with just the volume of different providers in, particularly in cybersecurity, right? There's just it's a very fragmented market, and I think the upside of having so many vendors is that you kind of need that many to address all of the different challenges that are popping up. Like every time there's a new challenge in broader technology, there's a security component to it. So there's opportunity for a new startup. And if you just centralize on big platforms only, you're going to miss that benefit. If you broaden out and have too much fragmentation, it's a real challenge as well, because there's just too many vendors to deal with. So what I would say is, I think for sure you need a few platform vendors, right? I mean, they're taking care of the nuts and bolts every day of the week. But when it comes to specific challenges around things like generative AI that are really important to the business, that's where I think organizations need to look at best of breed and what's coming in this new generation. Because I think if you look at all the existing stacks, they've typically bolted on Gen AI. It's more of a marketing thing for a lot of those existing technology platforms, right? They're rebadging themselves. Oh, now with Gen AI, and it's typically just a chat bot or something like that. I think what we need to look at now is also the emerging vendors that are trying to solve the problem from the ground up in the Gen AI era, because you make a whole different set of product decisions in that case. So I think, as ever, it has to be a blend for the enterprise. We're not getting away from that.
Mm-hmm. And Alex, when you think about it through the portfolio manager's perspective, you're looking at public companies, private companies. Are there certain subsectors within the cyberspace that look more attractive through the lens of a portfolio manager?
I think there've been two really interesting dynamics year to date, Jill. Number one is just the ongoing amount of M&A within the space. And I think there's almost a degree of paranoia, a certain sort of fear of missing out from the larger companies. And then second, when you actually look at the listed businesses, there's been an absolutely huge dispersion in performance terms. Some of this is obviously reputational, and there was a very well publicized outage at CrowdStrike. But I think really in our discussions with investors about cyber, and to the points made by the other guests on this program, you either have to be very big and really embrace this logic of platformization, or you've got to be very niche and doing something genuinely differentiated. And that's how we would look to allocate our investors' capital.
Yeah. And by the way, Alex, when you start to think about, how quickly this conversation could change 6 months from now, 1, 3, 5 years out, and then you start factoring what can happen with quantum computing. You and I have discussed this on the show a number of times. It could look very different as this data becomes structured and we create new products and a whole other set of, issues and challenges and opportunities arise. But when you start thinking about how quantum is entering these conversations, it could look very different if we had this conversation, let's call it a year from now.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we clearly see the pace of technological change is only accelerating. Quantum is without a doubt going to be massively exciting. It could be a potential game changer. But I think in terms of how investors gain exposure to that theme via liquid listed investments today, it's actually a lot harder. And almost when we try and take a step back, think about investment strategy, wherever possible, we're trying to invest in those metaphorical shovel makers, if you will, rather than miners. So there's businesses that really sit at the foundational layer within the IT space.
That's a great point that you make. And Alastair and Dave will ask the same question of you as well, starting with Alastair. When you think about this conversation where we could be 1, 3, 5 years out, what do you think the threat landscape or just the broader emerging tech landscape in general looks like?
Yeah, I mean, talking about the threat landscape, I think where the bad guys are is pretty much where enterprise is as well, where at the moment we're in the early innings of this Gen AI conversation, and we're figuring out really how to optimize and make more efficient what we were doing already. And I think what's coming next is going to be people actually looking at it from the ground up, like how do we actually employ this technology more aggressively from both an attacker and defender perspective. And so what you're seeing so far is probably more efficient types of attack that we've seen previously for the most part, right? Other than a few highly publicized deep fake incidents and so on. I think next year, as we get into it and beyond that, we're going to see far more novel approaches, new types of attack as people really get their hands on this technology. And I think the other thing I really worry about is it's as ever, it's lowering the barrier to entry for these cyber criminals. So you're going to have less sophisticated criminals that are able to pull off more advanced attacks, and that is never a good thing. So I think as ever, this space never stays still for long. But I think this for sure is a bit of a watershed moment. And yeah, every security team is going to need to be thinking about improving and upping their game once more.
And David, when we think about your outlook, you bring up a great point in your notes that leveraging these type of technologies for the cybersecurity teams, that's going to free them up to think about a bigger workload and more complex issues to solve. So we'll end it on a positive note when you think about your outlook.
Yeah, Jill, thanks. Alastair and Alex make really good points. And I do think there's something to be said for the ability to use AI to beat AI. So initially we started off talking about pattern recognition, looking for unusual behaviors with users or machines by examining logs and actions. And that's not necessarily a new technology that's been done for quite some time, but it's something that we've learned, generative AI is very, very good at and can advance that field very rapidly. And so there is absolutely a dearth of talent right now in cybersecurity. There's not enough cybersecurity experts out there. I think a lot of companies would agree with that. So this really does give the good guys, per se, a little bit more capacity to meet the increasing workload that is represented by the threats that we've been talking about. So, net, it's not going to be without bumps along the way, but we continue to feel that cybersecurity is one of the best long-term secular growth tailwinds in technology today.
All right. Appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.